How can you become so good at training your body has to build muscle? I've been trying to answer this question for almost 5 years now, and after a lot of trial and error, I've realized building muscle is not a difficult process to understand. It really isn't. The reason you clicked on this video is because you wanted to optimize your training to build as much muscle as possible. This is exactly what this video will cover. We'll cover the 5 most important variables of training that we need to understand to become so good at it that our body has no choice but to gain muscle. Now, before we understand how we should train to build muscle specifically, we need to understand how muscle growth actually works. There's 4 main components you need in order to grow whatever muscle in the body. You need water, energy, protein, and a stimulus. Water is necessary in any process in the body. Energy simply means calories. You need enough calories to actually grow. Protein, and specifically the amino acids within protein, are the building blocks of a muscle, and a stimulus is a stress you put on the muscle to give it a reason to grow. As you may have noticed, the first 3 components were about nutrition and the last one was about training. So in this video we will cover on that last component. Now, like I just mentioned, a stimulus is a stress put on the muscle, and that stress will cause the muscle to grow. After a while, our muscles get used to a certain level of stress and therefore need a bigger stress or stimulus to keep growing. The stimulus we create on our muscles is done with 3 different variables when we train: frequency, intensity, and volume. You need to visualize those 3 components as interconnected. This means you will get to a point where you can't increase variables more, and therefore your body will start to compensate. At some point, if you increase one variable, you will need to decrease another. If, for example, you increase your volume too much, your intensity will naturally decrease. If you increase your intensity too much, your volume and maybe even frequency will decrease. If your frequency increases and your volume increases as well, your intensity will naturally decrease. These things are interconnected and all play a role in creating a stimulus for muscle growth. In the next 15 minutes, we will cover each variable individually and how you can optimize each of them to maximize muscle growth. Now, before we even discuss the 3 components of stimulus creation, we need to determine our exercise selection. There's 2 main types of movements you can choose from: compound movements and isolation movements. Compound movements are movements which use multiple muscle groups at the same time to perform a movement. An isolation movement, on the other hand, is a single joint movement which focuses on using one muscle group at a time. Compound movements are, for example, the bench press, deadlift, squat, military press, amongst many others. Isolation movements are, for example, bicep curls, lateral raises, tricep pushdowns, and many more. In terms of overall muscle growth, we know that compound movements tend to be better, but we can't neglect isolation movements for specific muscle growth. Often compound movements will target general body muscle growth, but if you only do those, you will neglect smaller body parts that can really affect the way you look. If you do deadlifts, your hamstrings, glutes, quads, and back will be hit very well, however you won't ever grow big arms from those. Even if you added a bench press with it, your triceps won't grow a ton from it. You need to keep a proper balance between isolation movements and compound movements. My advice is to start a workout with compound movements because they are the most taxing and energy consuming, and finish off with isolation movements. Now that we've covered the ideal exercise selection, we can move on to our first variable, which is frequency. Now, frequency simply means the amount of times you train a muscle group per week. If you train your quads once a week and your back twice a week, you would have a frequency of 1 for quads and 2 for back. Your frequency of training is often seen as your split, or how you divide each muscle group throughout the week. There's 4 main splits you can choose from. You have push-pull legs, upper-lower, full body, and bro split. These seem to be the main splits used. Then obviously you have more advanced and personalized ones, but we won't discuss those. In order to choose the best frequency of training to build as much muscle as possible, it needs to check a couple criteria. First, it needs to hit muscle groups at least twice a week. We know very well that muscles need anywhere from 48 to 72 hours to recover. So when training a muscle group once a week, you're missing out on an opportunity to stimulate the muscle to grow. Also, having multiple training sessions for the same muscle group per week allows you to split your total volume, allowing you to have more quality work per workout. Second, it needs to allocate enough rest time between training each muscle group. If you train your chest every day, you won't give it enough time to recover unless you don't train it very hard, but in that case you're not giving the muscle a strong enough stimulus to grow anyway. If you keep that 48 to 72 hour rest time between training each muscle group, that seems to be the best, because then you're able to train muscle groups twice a week and have enough recovery between training sessions. Now, the first split we have is the push-pull leg, or better known as PPL. With the split, you train chest, shoulders, and triceps on your first day, back and biceps on your second day, and legs and abs on your third day. As a beginner, you could leave it at that, but if you want to maximize your muscle growth as a slightly more advanced lifter, you can repeat that same process on day 5, 6, and 7. On day 5, you will train chest, shoulders, and triceps. On day 6, you'll train back and biceps, and on day 7, you'll train legs and abs. Day 4 is a rest day. The second split is upper-lower. This is where you train your entire upper body one day, so back, chest, shoulders, biceps and triceps, and your lower body on the other. You can repeat this process a second time, so this is 4 days of training per week. Third is a full body split. You can do this 2 to 3 times a week, and here you'll simply train your full body each time. Number 4 is the bro split, which involves training one body part each day and doing all your volume for that muscle group on that day. One day you'll train back, another chest, another shoulders, and so on. The training frequency that seems to be the best is push-pull legs or upper-lower. With both training styles, you train each muscle group twice a week and you allow enough rest between each session. You're also able to split your volume equally throughout the week. Full body is a good option as well, but the issue with it is that you tend to fatigue around the end of your workout and does not hit those last muscle groups with enough intensity. Otherwise, you still hit each muscle group at least twice a week, sometimes 3 times, and you also allow for at least 48 hours of rest between each muscle group. The one that isn't ideal is the bro split. With this, you only train each muscle group only once a week and is therefore not optimal. To maximize muscle growth, you needed to train muscle groups at least twice a week. One, because your muscles don't need a full week to recover, but also because you're not able to split your total volume across multiple workouts. You're doing all your volume in one session, which means you won't be able to have as much quality work as if you split that work across 2 sessions. So for maximum muscle growth, you can either choose an upper-lower split or a PPL split. The main difference is that PPL will have you 6 days a week in the gym, and upper-lower will have you 4 days a week in the gym, but for slightly longer. That is based on your personal preference. Now, our second variable will be intensity. When people talk about intensity, they often refer to the level of effort you put into sets and how intense they are. This can be measured by how close you get to failure. Failure being when you can't complete another rep with complete form despite maximum effort. Intensity is measured by how close you get to that point of failure. Now, there's 2 main terms and metrics used to describe the intensity of a set. First is your RIR, or reps in reserve. This measures how many sets you could still have done on a set before getting to failure. For example, if you did a bench press and could realistically still have done 2 reps before hitting failure, you had 2 reps in reserve. Second, we have RPE, or rating of perceived exertion. This is a rating from 1 to 10 we give to sets to measure the intensity of that set. An RPE of 1 to 4 is a set that is taken very lightly and is very easy. An RPE of 5 to 6 is when you still have 4 to 6 reps in reserve. An RPE of 7 is when you still have 3 reps in reserve. A 7.5 is when you still could do 2 reps and possibly 3. At an RPE of 8, you still had 2 reps in reserve. An RPE of 8.5 is when you definitely could do 1 more rep and possibly 2. An RPE of 9 is when you could do 1 more rep. And an RPE of 10 is when you can't possibly perform another rep with good technique. If, for example, you did bicep curls and you could do 1 more rep if you pushed it at the end, you would have an RPE of 9. Now, how intense should sets be to maximize muscle growth? Some people like to claim that taking every single working set to failure is ideal, and this can work for a lot of people. Sam Solik is a great example of taking sets not only to failure, but way past it as well by doing many half reps. From the time I started training, very quickly did I start taking every single set to failure, simply because it felt better and it felt more effective. I never really liked the idea of leaving reps in reserve, so in many cases, taking sets all the way to failure can be effective for many people. However, scientifically, it seems to be more ideal to take sets close to failure, but not completely. An RPE of 8 or 9 is enough to stimulate muscle growth, and you shouldn't have more than 2 or 3 reps in reserve. Now, for every exercise you do, I would still do 1 set to complete failure to know what failure looks like. If you never go to failure, how are you supposed to know what that looks like, and therefore, how are you supposed to know what an RPE of 8 or 9 looks like? Based on what we know, you don't need to take sets to complete failure, but I would still keep 1 set to failure to know what that looks like. In both cases, there's an agreement that sets should be taken close to failure or to complete failure. There are some exceptions where leaving more reps in reserve makes sense for recovery, but this mostly applies to strength training, which is not our focus here. And there's also an exception for beginners where going to failure as a beginner can damage your muscles too much much and leave you sore for days. For the first weeks, your muscles will grow regardless of how intense you go, since in any case weights are a completely new stimulus. At the end of the day, I would try the scientific advice first and then adapt according to what personally suits you best. If you prefer taking your sets all the way to failure and it doesn't impair your recovery, keep doing that. The only rule to respect is to not go too low. Don't go below that RPE of 8 or 9 and keep working sets close to failure. Our third variable is volume. This is seen as the total amount of work you do and is often measured by taking the amount of sets you do per week, the amount of reps you do per set, and the amount of weight used during those sets. So what is the ideal amount of sets to maximize muscle growth? The amount of sets done can be divided into two different types of sets: warm-up sets and working sets. Warm-up sets are exactly what they're called. They're done to prepare and warm up the muscle for the working sets. The main reasons we want to do those sets is because 1, they help you perform your working sets better, and 2, they also help you avoid injury. Now, working sets are what actually matter and where you go close to failure. These sets are done to damage the muscle and stimulate growth in the muscle. When we measure what amount of sets is ideal to do per week, we measure how many working sets or sets close to failure we should perform, not warm-up sets. Those are not counted in the total amount of sets you do. Now, volume kinda has this U-shaped curve, which shows that more volume after a while becomes unnecessary and even counterproductive after a certain point. This means that after too many sets, you get into a state of overtraining and you're hindering your muscle growth progress. The general consensus is that 10 to 20 working sets taken close to failure or to failure completely per week seems to be the sweet spot for muscle growth, and anything beyond that range is something called junk volume, which simply means unnecessary volume that won't build any more muscle. Smaller muscle groups like biceps and triceps will have enough volume with 10 to 20 working sets per week. What you ideally want to do is spread those weekly sets equally throughout training sessions. For example, if you train biceps twice a week and you had 12 working sets to do, you would have 6 working sets in one workout and 6 working sets in the other. That way you have an equal amount of work per workout and you have more quality sets every single workout. If you did 90% of your sets in one workout, your last sets would be much worse because you're already fatigued. Next, we need to discuss which rep range will maximize muscle growth. There's often a lot of conflicting ideas about the rep ranges. Some seem to think that 3 to 8 reps is ideal, others say 8 to 12 is ideal, and others claim that 12 to 20 reps is the best. So what is it? The truth is that rep ranges can go very wide and still be effective. From research, we know that rep ranges as low as 3 up until 30 can cause similar muscle growth at a condition that the intensity is high enough. The amount of reps you do doesn't really matter as long as you take sets close to failure. Now, there are a couple caveats. First is that when you start to go too light in weight and too high in reps, you will see a lot less growth even if you go to failure. Second is that very low rep ranges have a higher probability of injury. When you push a bigger weight, it puts more pressure on your joints and therefore have more chances of getting injured. Third is that even though higher reps can still be effective for muscle growth, they can get long, boring, and also harder than lower rep ranges. First is that when you're at rep 23, it starts to get boring. Second, the longer you spend in a set, the more lactic buildup you have and the more painful the set will feel. For some, this can mess up your adherence to your routine. So even though you can go higher or lower in reps, I would still recommend people to stay in between 8 to 15 reps. 8 to 10 reps for compound movements and 12 to 15 reps for isolation movements. Now, in terms of the ideal weight for muscle growth, that just depends on you. You will need to find a weight that matches your ideal intensity and volume for each exercise. That means a weight that will get you in that 8 to 15 rep range and very close or to complete failure. Then finally, we have 2 last variables to discuss. During our workout and during our sets, we will need to adopt a certain tempo and range of motion. We can maximize both variables to maximize our muscle growth as well. First is our tempo. This simply refers to the speed at which you perform a rep. There's 2 parts of a rep. You have the eccentric part, which is when your muscle is stretching, and you have the concentric part, which is when your muscle is contracting. We know 2 things about the eccentric part. One is that it is the part of the movement where your muscle is the strongest, and 2, it is the part of the movement where most of the muscle damage is caused. So it is important we don't let the weight free fall and instead try to spend more time in that part of the movement because you will have the most amount of growth there. We need to control the weight in that part of the movement. So the ideal way to perform a rep is to push fast and hard on the concentric part of the movement and then slowly go through the eccentric for 1 to 8 seconds. I wouldn't go above 5 seconds personally, but up until 8 seconds is effective. Second, we have range of motion. This simply represents how far the weight travels during a rep. This range of motion is a lot shorter than this range of motion. So what is the ideal range of motion to maximize muscle growth? There's 3 distinct ranges people go for. You have short length partial range of motion, full range of motion, and long length partial range of motion. The first is when you perform a half rep in the most contracted part of the movement. The second is where you complete a full rep, and the last is when you perform a half rep but in the most stretched part of the movement. If we had to rank all of them from best to worst for causing muscle growth, short length partials would be in the last place, full range of motion would be in second place, and long length partials would be best for muscle growth. Many have this belief that full range of motion is still the best, but in reality we have a lot of evidence that staying in the stretched part of the movement is much more effective at building muscle. Another thing to remember is that the best range of motion is the one that gets you in the most stretched position. We now understand that staying in the stretched part of the movement is best for muscle building, but we also know that getting in a deeper stretch is better as well. Now, at the start of this video, I explained that a muscle needed a stimulus or a stress in order to grow. The issue is that our muscles get used to a certain level of stress after a while, so in order to keep growing, we need to increase that stress. This is called progressive overload, a well-known term in the fitness community. Once you understand the three main variables of training, which are frequency, intensity, and volume, you can slowly improve those over time. Now, obviously there's a limit to which you can increase your frequency and intensity, so I would advise you don't focus on that. What I think you should focus on is improving either the weight you're using or the amount of reps you're doing. Don't think about increasing the amount of sets, the amount of workouts, or the intensity of the sets. Simply focus on increasing the weight or reps and do that on a frequent enough basis. So, by understanding these 5 variables of training, you can now be so good at it that your body will have to build muscle. Of course, you will still need to keep good mind-muscle connection, enough rest time, and so on, but these things have less of an impact on your ability to build muscle. Now, this should still be a focus to have during a workout. You should also keep good technique with every exercise you do. If you're unsure about the technique of a certain exercise, there's plenty of resources online you can watch. So, that's it for this video. Hope you enjoyed it, hope you learned something. If you're currently in a season of bulking, or you want to learn as much as possible about it, you can watch this video on the best way to bulk up as a skinny guy, which will teach you everything about that.